5,000 years ago, a goddess was said to die, rot on a hook in the dark, and return breathing, walking, and ruling again. Her name was carved into clay before kings learned to sign their own decrees, before cities learned how to remember themselves. Why would the earliest civilizations entrust love, war, law, desire, and annihilation to one figure? Why does her story refuse to behave like myth, and instead read like a record of power? Why do her symbols appear wherever authority first learned to speak? Why were her temples older than dynasties, her rites older than moral order? And why does history still hesitate when explaining how she rose? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself and let's dive in. The land between the rivers did not begin as an empire or a legend, but as mud, reeds, and water that refused to stay still. Long before stone palaces or written laws, seasonal floods from the Tigris and Euphrates spread across the plain, leaving behind thick silt that could grow grain if humans learned how to tame it. It was here, in this unstable world of shifting channels and marsh grass, that the first true cities emerged, and with them appeared a presence that did not behave like a gentle mother or distant sky god. She was already there when the first walls rose, already receiving offerings before writing learned how to tell stories. Uruk stood at the center of this transformation, not yet the city of heroic epics, but a vast experiment in human cooperation. Thousands of people lived together without kinship tying them all together. They depended on organized labor, stored surplus, and shared belief. In this environment, a goddess who embodied tension rather than harmony made sense. The earliest traces of her worship do not come from hymns or myths, but from administrative tablets, lists of barley, beer, wool, and livestock delivered to a temple marked with a sign that scholars later recognized as her name. Even before poetry, she was an institution. That sign, the 8-pointed star, appears again and again in the archaeological record. Pressed into clay seals, carved into stone, stamped onto offerings, it marked ownership, authority, and presence. To modern eyes, it looks decorative, but in its time it functioned like a seal of power, announcing that what stood beneath it belonged to the goddess. The star corresponded to the planet Venus, the brightest object in the sky after the sun and moon, visible at dawn and again at dusk. The Sumerians understood that these were not two stars, but one body appearing at different times, a realization that required careful observation over generations. That shifting brilliance, sometimes heralding sunrise, sometimes lingering after sunset, matched the goddess perfectly. Beautiful, dominant, and impossible to fix in one role. Her earliest name, Inanna, is often translated as Lady of Heaven, but the words themselves resist easy breakdown. The signs used to write her name do not behave like simple components snapped together, which has led scholars to suspect that her worship may have predated the Sumerian language itself. In other words, the people who learned to write may have inherited her from an older, half-forgotten world, absorbing a powerful local deity into their expanding urban religion. By the time texts become readable, she is already too important to explain from scratch. At Uruk, Her main sanctuary was known as the Inanna, the House of Heaven. It was not merely a temple, but a complex that functioned like the heart of the city. Fields, herds, workshops, and storehouses were administered through it. Priests and priestesses managed labor, scribes tracked resources, and rituals structured the calendar. To serve the goddess was not a private act of devotion, but a full-time occupation woven into the economy itself. Her worship shaped how people worked, traded, and organized time. Early texts describe her appearing in 3 primary forms, tied directly to the movement of Venus. As the morning star, she rose before the sun, associated with beginnings, ambition, and forward motion. As the evening star, she appeared after sunset, linked to endings, desire, and transition. A third aspect emphasized her princely authority, portraying her not just as a celestial presence, but as a ruler who commanded obedience. These were not separate goddesses, but expressions of a single force seen under different conditions, much like the same city looks different at dawn, midday, and night. Unlike many later deities, she was never passive. Even in fragmentary early myths, she complains, she demands, she seeks more than what has been assigned to her. This matters because Mesopotamian religion was not built on the idea of fixed divine job descriptions. Gods negotiated power, competed, and formed alliances. In this environment, Inanna stands out for how aggressively she expands her reach. She does not wait for authority to be granted. She takes it. She belonged to the Anunnaki, the assembly of great gods whose name roughly means princely offspring, suggesting a divine aristocracy responsible for setting the rules of existence. Lists from the 3rd millennium BCE rank her among the highest of them, sometimes placed just after the sky god An and the air god Enlil, ahead of figures associated with wisdom or craftsmanship. These lists were not theological abstractions. They reflected which gods received the most temples, offerings, and political attention. Inanna's high ranking meant real influence over how cities justified power. What made her unsettling was not just her authority, but her contradictions. She presided over sexual desire and battlefield slaughter with equal intensity. She could bless crops and shatter cities. In one breath, she promised pleasure. In the next, she unleashed terror. Modern thought tends to separate these domains, treating love and violence as opposites, but for the people of early Mesopotamia, they were linked by the same overwhelming force. Passion, whether erotic or martial, dissolved restraint. It pushed humans beyond ordinary behavior into states where rules bent or broke. Visual depictions from this period reinforce that ambiguity. She appears standing at the threshold of her temple, accessible yet elevated, flanked by reed bundles that marked sacred space. In some images, she receives offerings from nude priests, their lack of clothing symbolizing vulnerability rather than shame. To approach her required stripping away protection, standing exposed before a power that could grant favor or destruction. She was close, but never safe. Her emergence coincided with humanity's shift from village life to dense urban centers. Cities offered opportunity, wealth, and cultural innovation, but they also introduced hierarchy, exploitation, and organized violence. Inanna became the divine expression of this new reality. She did not promise moral comfort. She promised success, and success in a city came at a cost. To gain her favor was to thrive in a world that rewarded boldness and punished weakness. This helps explain why she was never confined to domestic roles. She was not a hearth goddess or a symbol of quiet continuity. She belonged to streets, markets, battlefields, and bedrooms. She presided over moments when order was made and unmade. If the city was a machine that turned desire into power and surplus into dominance, Inanna was its spirit. By the end of the 4th millennium BCE, her name was inseparable from Uruk itself. Kings ruled in her shadow. Priests spoke in her voice. Her star governed the sky while her temple governed land and labor. She was not an abstract ideal, but a living presence embedded in daily survival. To understand the earliest cities is to understand why such a goddess was necessary, and why she could never be gentle. Civilization did not begin with balance. It began with force, ambition, and risk. And standing at that beginning was Inanna. Power in ancient Mesopotamia did not flow from abstract law or inherited blood alone. It moved through family, favor, and proximity to the divine, and nowhere is this clearer than in the tangled genealogy surrounding Inanna. Her place among the gods was never explained with a single, stable family tree. Instead, her parentage shifted depending on city, period, and political need, revealing a worldview in which divine identity was flexible, negotiated, and alive. The most widely accepted tradition names her as the daughter of Nanna, the moon god, known later as Sin. Nanna ruled the night sky with steady regularity, his crescent marking the passage of months and the rhythm of festivals. Time itself bent to his cycle. To be born of the moon was to be tied to measurement, order, and recurrence, the quiet structure that allowed agriculture, trade, and ritual to function. Inanna, however, did not resemble her father in temperament. Where the moon returned with predictable calm, she flared and vanished like Venus, burning bright, disappearing, and re-emerging transformed. The contrast between father and daughter mirrored the tension between stability and disruption at the heart of early civilization. Her mother in this tradition was Ningal, whose name means Great Lady, a lunar goddess associated with protection and intercession. Ningal appears in hymns as a compassionate figure, pleading with higher gods on behalf of humanity. If Inanna inherited anything from her mother, it may have been influence rather than gentleness, the ability to stand before greater powers and be heard. Together, Nanna and Ningal formed a divine household that linked sky, time, and fertility, placing Inanna within the fundamental rhythms of existence, while setting her apart as something volatile within that structure. Yet other texts name An, the sky god himself, as her father. An stood at the apex of the divine order, remote and immense, less a personality than a presence, like the dome of the sky under which everything else unfolded. To call Inanna his daughter was to elevate her beyond ordinary rank, suggesting she belonged to the oldest layer of divine authority. In this version, her independence makes sense. A direct child of heaven would answer to few equals. Her defiance, ambition, and refusal to submit align with this elevated origin, as though she carried the sky's vastness within her. A third tradition identifies Enki as her father, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and creative intelligence. Enki was associated with the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean imagined as the source of life and knowledge. He governed the May, the divine decrees that made civilization possible. Crafts, institutions, moral concepts, and social roles. If Inanna were his daughter, then her later acquisition of these powers reads not as theft, but as inheritance complicated by rivalry. It would tie her directly to culture itself, explaining her mastery over arts, politics, and transformation. These conflicting genealogies are not errors. They are evidence of a religious system that adapted as power shifted. As cities rose and fell, they rewrote divine relationships to reflect their own importance. A city devoted to Inanna emphasized lunar lineage. One asserting cosmic authority preferred An. A center of wisdom aligned her with Enki. Inanna's cult was ancient and widespread enough to absorb all of these without breaking. She became a goddess who could belong everywhere without being owned by any single tradition. What remains consistent across these versions is her relationship with her twin brother Utu, the sun god, later known as Shamash. Utu ruled daylight, justice, and truth. Nothing hidden could escape his gaze. Oaths sworn in his light-bound gods and mortals alike. His justice was relentless, not merciful, like the sun that reveals without choosing what it illuminates. Inanna's bond with Utu was unusually close. In myth after myth, he advises her, aids her, and protects her. When she plans dangerous actions, she consults him. When she needs help, he responds. Their connection reflects a balance between passion and order. Utu's light exposes, Inanna's star entices. He represents law as something visible and inescapable. She embodies desire that pulls people into risk. Together, they form a complete picture of power. The force that judges and the force that drives. Ancient listeners would have recognized this pairing as essential. A city without justice collapses into chaos. A city without desire stagnates and dies. If Utu is her radiant counterpart, then Ereshkigal is her dark mirror. Ereshkigal ruled the Underworld, the land of no return, a realm not of punishment but of inevitability. Everyone, king and peasant alike, ended there. Inanna calls her sister, a term that in Mesopotamian texts often signals equal rank rather than shared parents. Their domains never overlapped. Heaven and underworld were meant to remain separate. That separation defined life itself. The tension between them matters because it marks the boundary Inanna would later cross. Ereshkigal was not portrayed as evil. She was severe, unyielding, and solitary, a ruler whose power came from permanence rather than movement. Where Inanna thrived on change, Ereshkigal embodied finality. Their relationship was not affectionate or hostile, but fundamentally incompatible, like growth and decay occupying the same world without touching. Completing Inanna's inner circle was Ninshubur, her loyal minister. Ninshubur served as messenger, advisor, and anchor, a figure whose devotion never wavered. Inanna trusted her with instructions that assumed the possibility of failure, a rare admission from such a confident goddess. Ninshubur's loyalty would later save her life, but even here it reveals something crucial. Inanna, for all her power, did not act alone. She built networks, she rewarded devotion, she understood the value of those who stood beside her when ambition turned dangerous. Later traditions altered Ninshubur's gender, transforming her into male figures who served similar roles in other pantheons. This shift reflects changing attitudes towards authority and service, but it also underscores how essential the role was. Inanna required a constant witness, someone who remembered her words, carried her will, and acted when she could not. Power, even divine power, needed structure. Through these relationships, a pattern emerges. Inanna is always connected but never contained. Daughter, sister, lover, ruler, She occupies every role without being defined by any of them. She uses kinship as leverage rather than limitation. She moves between cosmic forces, linking night and day, life and death, order and desire. Her family is not a refuge, but a field of influence. This web of divine ties explains how she could dominate a world that often privileged male authority. She did not overthrow the system, she mastered it. By positioning herself at the intersection of lunar time, solar justice, subterranean wisdom, and celestial authority, she became unavoidable. To invoke one power was to encounter her shadow. Inanna's identity was not built on obedience or nurture, but on motion, negotiation, and confrontation. She did not wait to be placed within the divine order. She shaped that order around herself. In doing so, she became more than a goddess of a city or a function. She became the embodiment of power itself as the ancient world experienced it, relational, volatile, and inseparable from the forces that made civilization possible. Desire in the ancient world was not a private emotion or a moral problem. It was a force that moved bodies, fields, armies, and cities, and Inanna ruled it without apology. Her sexuality was never softened into metaphor or hidden behind modest language. It was named, sung, acted, and ritualized as something sacred and dangerous, capable of renewing the land or tearing it apart. To speak of her as a goddess of love is accurate only if love is understood as something that overwhelms reason and dissolves boundaries. The poems devoted to her erotic life are among the most direct texts to survive from antiquity. Composed in Sumerian and preserved on clay tablets, they describe her body with agricultural imagery so vivid that the connection between sex and fertility becomes unavoidable. Her vulva is compared to a fertile field dark with water, to a crescent moon ready to be filled, to a boat prepared for launch. These are not poetic flourishes meant to obscure meaning. They are deliberate equations. Just as seed enters soil and brings forth grain, desire enters the body and brings life. Inanna's sexuality is the engine of abundance. Her lover, Dumuzi, appears in these songs as both shepherd and king, a figure whose touch ensures that flocks multiply and crops ripen. He praises her breasts as fields heavy with produce, speaks of drinking from them like sweet milk, and approaches her bed as one approaches a sacred space. The language is joyful, impatient, and unashamed. There is no sense of sin or transgression. To desire the goddess is to participate in the renewal of the world. Yet Inanna is never portrayed as a wife in the domestic sense. She does not manage a household or raise children. Marriage, as a social institution, is not her domain. Instead, she governs erotic attraction itself, the sudden pull that disrupts routine and drives people toward risk. This distinction matters. Domestic stability preserves order, but erotic desire threatens it. Inanna presides over that threat, the moment when rules loosen and new possibilities emerge. This is why her temples were associated with sexual rites that modern observers often misunderstand. Certain priestesses and ritual specialists served her through acts that blurred the line between sexuality and worship. While the exact details remain debated, what is clear is that sex in her cult wasn't treated as exploitation or moral failure. It was a channel of power. To give pleasure or receive it under her name was to invoke her presence directly, bypassing social hierarchy and convention. Her cult also made space for people who did not fit neatly into gender categories. The Gala priests, who performed laments in a dialect associated with women's speech, and other devotees who adopted clothing or behaviors that crossed gender lines, occupied respected ritual roles. Hymns credit Inanna with the power to turn men into women and women into men, not as punishment, but as transformation. In a world that relied on clear social roles to function, she ruled the places where those roles dissolved. This fluidity extended into her role as a war goddess. At first glance, love and war appear incompatible, but for the people who worshipped her, they were expressions of the same intensity. Battle, like sexual ecstasy, involved loss of self, surge of adrenaline, and the willingness to cross boundaries. Inanna's warriors did not fight calmly. They fought in frenzy, driven by passion rather than discipline. Victory came through overwhelming force, not careful balance. In art, she appears armed, with weapons protruding from her shoulders, sometimes standing on a lion or accompanied by one. The lion was not chosen for beauty, but for dominance. Its roar echoed thunder, and Inanna herself was associated with storms that brought both rain and devastation. When kings invoked her before battle, they did not ask for mercy. They asked for annihilation of their enemies. Royal inscriptions praise her for filling rivers with blood and making mountains tremble. These are not metaphors meant to shock modern readers. They reflect a worldview in which survival depended on decisive violence. City-states competed for land, water, and trade routes. To lose a war was often to be erased. Inanna embodied the brutal clarity of that reality. She did not soften conflict with moral justification. She unleashed it. Her patronage of kings reveals how these domains converged. Rulers claimed to be her lovers or spouses, not merely as poetic flattery, but as political strategy. Through her, they gained legitimacy that combined erotic attraction and military success. The sacred marriage ritual, in which the king united with her high priestess, was believed to ensure fertility of both land and state. The same act that promised abundant harvest also confirmed the king's right to command armies. This duality made her indispensable. A city needed grain and protection, pleasure and power. To separate these needs was to misunderstand how fragile urban life was. Inanna offered all of it, but never gently. She demanded participation, surrender, and risk. Those who served her entered relationships that could elevate or destroy them. Her role extended beyond sex and war into broader fertility. She governed storehouses, harvests, and abundance. But her fertility was not maternal. It was excessive, intense, and seasonal, like the blazing summer that brings growth to its peak before scorching the land. She favored fullness that bordered on danger, prosperity that tempted collapse. This intensity explains why she attracted devotion from those on the margins of society. Prostitutes, tavern keepers, and others who operated outside respectable structures found protection in her name. These spaces were sites of exchange, information, and social mixing, crucial to city life, but often viewed with suspicion. Inanna sanctified them. She did not erase stigma, but she transformed it into power. Astrally, her identity as Venus reinforced everything she represented. The planet's behavior puzzled ancient observers. It vanished for days or weeks, only to reappear on the opposite horizon. To modern astronomy, this is orbital mechanics, but to ancient eyes, it looked like death and return. Inanna was understood to disappear into darkness and come back renewed. This celestial pattern mirrored human experiences of loss and recovery, of desire fading and reigniting. By the height of Sumerian civilization, her reach had become nearly total. She governed love, war, fertility, justice, music, and political authority. Other gods stayed within defined domains. Inanna crossed them. She did not represent balance. She represented momentum. Her worship reveals an uncomfortable truth about early civilization. It was built not on harmony, but on managed extremes. Growth required destruction. Desire required loss. Power required submission. Inanna did not resolve these tensions. She embodied them. To worship her was to accept that life's most generative forces were also its most dangerous. And for the people who lived under burning suns and looming walls, that truth felt honest. Among all the stories told about Inanna, none captures her hunger for power more clearly than the moment she decided what she already possessed was not enough. She was Queen of Heaven, patron of Uruk, embodiment of desire and war, yet even this vast authority failed to satisfy her. Civilization itself, the hidden machinery that allowed cities to function, remained concentrated elsewhere, guarded by a god whose wisdom was ancient and heavy. Inanna did not challenge him with weapons or threats. She chose a subtler path, one that revealed how power truly moved in the early world. Enki ruled from Eridu, the city the Sumerians remembered as the first place where kingship descended from heaven. Beneath his temple lay the Abzu, imagined as a deep, freshwater ocean under the earth, the source of life and intelligence. Enki was not a warrior or a tyrant. He was clever, patient, and generous, the kind of god who solved problems rather than enforcing obedience. What made him formidable was his possession of the me, the divine decrees that structured civilization itself. The me were not abstract ideas floating in the mind. They were treated as tangible powers, almost like objects that could be held, transferred, and displayed. Each me represented an element of ordered life: kingship, priesthood, writing, music, craftsmanship, justice, deceit, victory, destruction, and dozens more. Together they formed a complete map of what it meant to live in a city rather than a village. Whoever controlled the me controlled civilization's operating system. Inanna knew this. The myth doesn't hide her intention. She sets out for Eridu explicitly to increase the glory of her city. She adorns herself carefully, placing the crown of authority on her head, praising her own beauty, and preparing her words. This is not a casual visit between relatives. It is a calculated campaign. She understands Enki's nature as well as her own. Where force would fail, charm might succeed. When she arrives, Enki welcomes her with hospitality that borders on indulgence. In Mesopotamian culture, hospitality carried moral weight. To feed a guest, to offer drink, was to create obligation. Enki orders a feast: butter cakes, cold water, and sweet beer, the fermented drink that blurred judgment while loosening tongues. The scene is deliberately intimate. Two powerful deities sit together, drink together, and speak as equals. As the beer flows, something shifts. Enki, whose wisdom is legendary, begins to give gifts. One by one, he offers Inanna the May. Each gift follows a ritual formula. He names the power. She accepts it. The exchange repeats, almost mechanically, yet its consequences are enormous. Kingship passes to her hands. The arts of love and prostitution follow. Truth and falsehood, judgment and rebellion, craftsmanship and destruction, All are handed over without resistance. The list is striking for its moral neutrality. Inanna receives not only what modern minds might call positive traits, but also those that enable cruelty and chaos. Civilization, the myth insists, is not built from virtue alone. It requires hierarchy, manipulation, and the capacity to destroy as much as the ability to create. By accepting all of it, Inanna becomes complete. She does not curate power, she absorbs it. The text plays with irony. Enki is drunk. Inanna is not. She remains clear-eyed, aware of exactly what is happening. Some scholars have suggested sexual symbolism beneath the surface, noting that her boat of heaven, which carries the me away, may double as an erotic image. Whether or not one accepts this reading, the story is undeniably charged with seduction. Power moves through pleasure, not violence. Eventually, Inanna departs Eridu with her prize, loading the me onto her vessel and setting course for Uruk. Only when the beer's effects fade does Enki realize what has happened. His reaction is panic. The me were not trivial possessions. They were his responsibility, entrusted to him as custodian of civilization. Without them, his city loses primacy. Authority drains away. He sends his servant to pursue Inanna, unleashing waves of supernatural beings to intercept her. The pursuit unfolds like a dark comedy. Each time the creatures reach her, her loyal minister, Ninshubur, intervenes, fending them off through cleverness or force. The repetition reinforces a key idea. Once power has been legitimately given and accepted, even foolishly, it cannot simply be reclaimed. Gift-giving creates reality. When Inanna reaches Uruk, the city celebrates. The gates receive her. The people rejoice. The me are displayed and installed, transforming Uruk into the cultural and political center of the world. Civilization itself has changed address. Enki, defeated, sends a message of reconciliation. There is no prolonged war, no cosmic punishment. The transfer stands. Historically, this myth mirrors a real shift. Eridu, though ancient and revered, was eclipsed by Uruk as population, trade, and influence concentrated elsewhere. The story reframes that transition not as decline, but as destiny, orchestrated by the city's patron goddess. Theologizing political change gave it legitimacy and permanence. But the myth does more than explain history. It reveals Inanna's character with ruthless clarity. She does not ask permission to grow. She identifies where power resides and takes it. She understands systems and exploits their weaknesses. Enki's flaw is not ignorance, but generosity, trust, and attachment to ritual courtesy. Inanna uses these against him without remorse. Yet the story does not condemn her. It celebrates her success. Cleverness triumphs over authority. Charm defeats seniority. The audience is meant to admire her audacity. Civilization itself, the myth suggests, advances not through obedience, but through disruption. Innovation requires someone willing to overstep boundaries. This episode also reframes gendered assumptions. Inanna does not wield power by mimicking masculine force. She uses qualities associated with femininity in ancient thought: beauty, persuasion, social intelligence. The myth does not present this as lesser power, it presents it as superior. She outplays a god whose wisdom spans ages. By acquiring the me, Inanna becomes more than a goddess of instinct. She becomes the guarantor of structured life. Kings rule through her. Crafts flourish through her. Laws carry weight through her. She now embodies both chaos and order, the spark and the framework. This dual mastery makes her unparalleled. The tale insists on a difficult truth. Civilization is not a gift handed down from benevolent authority. It is seized, negotiated, sometimes stolen. It passes through desire, error, and excess. Inanna's triumph at Eridu shows her at her most triumphant and most dangerous. She proves that power belongs not to those who guard it most carefully, but to those bold enough to claim it and brave enough to live with its consequences. From the heights of heaven, Inanna turned her attention downward, toward a realm that no god entered lightly. Power had followed her wherever she went, bending to charm or force, but the underworld was different. It was not a rival city or a jealous god's domain. It was a boundary, the line that separated movement from stillness, breath from dust. To cross it was to challenge the one law that applied equally to mortals and immortals. And yet, Inanna chose to descend. The ancient text opens with stark simplicity. She set her mind on the great below. There is no hesitation, no justification offered at first. Later explanations appear, polite reasons about attending funeral rites, but the structure of the story makes clear that these are pretexts. Inanna does not travel to the underworld out of duty or compassion. She goes because it exists beyond her reach. As always, the limit itself is the provocation. Before leaving, she prepares with care that reveals both confidence and caution. She adorns herself with the symbols that define her authority, the crown that marks sovereignty, beads that signal status, a breastplate associated with both sexuality and command, measuring tools that represent judgment, and a royal robe that gathers all of these into visible power. Each item is more than decoration. Together, they are the accumulated me she carries on her body, the portable essence of her divinity. She also prepares for failure. Inanna instructs her loyal minister Ninshubur to wait 3 days. If she does not return, Ninshubur is to mourn publicly, tear her face, dress as a beggar, and go before the greatest gods to demand help. This detail matters. Inanna does not assume invincibility. She understands that the underworld operates by rules even she may not bend. Her courage is not ignorance, it is calculated risk. As she travels, she abandons her temples and cities, moving farther from the living world. The journey itself is a stripping away of presence. When she reaches the outer gate of the underworld, she announces herself in the language of supremacy. She is the Queen of Heaven. She demands entry. The gatekeeper Neti does not deny her outright. Instead, he consults his mistress, Ereshkigal, ruler of the great below. Ereshkigal's response is immediate and severe. She recognizes the threat. Inanna's presence is not neutral. If the Queen of Heaven enters the realm of death fully armed with her powers, the separation between worlds collapses. Ereshkigal devises a solution that preserves the law while neutralizing the intruder. The gates will open, but one by one, and at each gate, Inanna will be required to surrender a piece of her regalia. The process unfolds with ritual precision. At the first gate, her crown is removed. Inanna protests, demanding explanation, but Neti replies with a phrase that will echo throughout the descent. The laws of the underworld are perfect and cannot be questioned. At the second gate, her beads are taken. At the third, another layer of ornament. Each time, her status diminishes. Each time, the answer is the same. By the fourth gate, the breastplate is removed, stripping away both sexual authority and martial command. At the fifth, the ring that symbolizes binding power. At the sixth, the measuring rod and line, tools of justice and order. With each loss, Inanna becomes less goddess and more exposed being. By the time she reaches the seventh gate, the royal robe itself is taken, leaving her naked. Nakedness here is not erotic. It is absolute vulnerability. Inanna enters the throne room of Ereshkigal bowed low, stripped of every symbol that once made the world bend around her. For the first time, her presence does not dominate the space she occupies. In the underworld, there's no crowd to awe, no city to command, no ritual that favors her. She stands alone before powers that do not care who she was above. The judgment is swift. The Anunnaki of the underworld fix their gaze upon her. They do not argue or deliberate aloud. Their look itself is lethal. Inanna is struck dead. Her body is hung on a hook like meat left to dry. The imagery is deliberate and brutal. The goddess of life, desire, and motion becomes inert matter, subject to decay. The narrative lingers on this inversion because it is the point. Even she cannot resist death. For 3 days and 3 nights she hangs there. Time passes above. Ninshubur waits. The world continues, but something is wrong. The absence of Inanna is felt not as silence, but as imbalance. Desire loses its force. Momentum stalls. When the 3rd day ends and she has not returned, Ninshubur follows her instructions exactly. She mourns, she humiliates herself, and she goes before the great gods. Enlil, god of air and authority, refuses to intervene. Inanna sought the underworld, he says. She must accept its laws. Nanna, her father in many traditions, also refuses. The descent was her choice. Consequences cannot be undone. These refusals reinforce a harsh truth. Cosmic order does not bend for love or kinship. Death is not negotiable through status. Only Enki responds differently. The god of wisdom does not lecture. He acts. From beneath his fingernails, he fashions 2 small beings, neither male nor female, creatures who exist outside the binaries that govern both living and dead. He gives them the food and water of life and sends them downward with precise instructions. These beings do not challenge Ereshkigal. They do not demand or threaten. They listen. They mirror her cries as she suffers in pain, whether from grief, labor, or some deeper cosmic agony. In a realm defined by isolation, their empathy is radical. Moved by this recognition, Ereshkigal offers them a gift. Anything they ask. They ask only for the corpse hanging on the hook. Bound by her word, Ereshkigal agrees. The food and water of life are applied, and Inanna rises. She has done what no god before her accomplished. She has died and returned. But the underworld does not release its dead freely. As Inanna prepares to leave, the gala demons attach themselves to her. A substitute must be provided. Someone must take her place. Death demands balance. Inanna ascends, followed by these relentless figures, and the cost of her return waits to be paid. The descent has transformed her. She returns not triumphant, but altered. She has learned the limit of power. She has seen what remains when titles and symbols are stripped away. The underworld did not destroy her ambition, but it carved it into something harder, colder, and more exacting. From this moment forward, her choices will carry the weight of death itself. Inanna's return to the world of the living did not restore the universe to what it had been before her descent. The light came back, the temples reopened, desire stirred again. But something irreversible had entered the structure of existence. Death had not been conquered. It had been acknowledged, negotiated with, and woven into the rhythm of life. The gala demons made sure of that. They followed Inanna closely, silent and patient, reminding her that resurrection was not a gift without cost. These beings were not monsters in the dramatic sense. They were functionaries, embodiments of inevitability. They did not rage or threaten. They enforced balance. Someone must take her place. The demand was absolute, as impersonal as gravity. Inanna understood this immediately. Her journey upward became a procession of judgment, each step a test of recognition and loyalty. As she moved through the cities that once praised her name, the demons proposed substitutes. They pointed to figures who had benefited from her power, who had lived comfortably under her protection. Inanna did not choose hastily. She observed. She measured responses to her absence. Those who had mourned, who had torn their clothes, who had acknowledged that something essential had been lost, were spared. Their grief marked awareness. Awareness carried value. When Ninshubur was offered, Inanna's refusal was sharp and final. Her minister had fulfilled every instruction with precision. She had humbled herself publicly, risking ridicule and rejection to secure help. Without her, Inanna would still hang lifeless in the underworld. Loyalty like that could not be repaid with death. Inanna was not merciful by instinct, but she was exacting. Faithfulness earned protection. This pattern repeated. The demons waited. They were in no hurry. They understood the structure of the story better than anyone. The substitute would not be chosen from among the devoted or the grieving. It would come from indifference. When Inanna reached Uruk, the city that defined her power, the contrast was immediate. Life had continued. Administration functioned. Authority had not collapsed. On the surface, this was stability. But at its center sat Dumuzi, her lover and king, adorned in luxury, enjoying rule as if nothing had been lost. There were no signs of mourning, no gestures of absence. He had stepped into the space her disappearance created and made it comfortable. Inanna's response was instantaneous. There is no debate in the text, no internal struggle. Her gaze fixes on him, and judgment is delivered with a single word. Take him. The demons do not hesitate. Dumuzi's transformation from ruler to prey is brutal in its speed. Power offers no protection here. Intimacy does not soften consequence. What follows is not heroic resistance, but fear. Dumuzi flees, pleads, and calls on gods to save him. He changes form, hides among animals, clings to the edges of the world. The narrative dwells on his terror deliberately. This is not the dignified death of a martyr. It is the raw panic of a being who realizes too late that privilege without recognition is empty. His sister Geshtinanna responds differently. She mourns openly. She does not deny what is happening or try to escape it. Instead, she engages with the law the demons serve. Through her intervention, the absolute demand for substitution becomes structured. A compromise is reached that does not abolish death, but organizes it. Dumuzi will descend to the underworld for half the year. Geshtinanna will take his place for the remaining half. This division does not erase suffering. It distributes it. Time itself becomes the mechanism through which loss and return alternate. The myth establishes not rescue, but rotation. This arrangement explains the seasons in terms that mattered deeply to early agricultural societies. When Dumuzi is below, the land dries, vegetation withers, and the world contracts under heat. When he returns, growth resumes. Fertility does not appear magically. It follows mourning. The earth recovers because absence was acknowledged. Inanna's role in this outcome is often misunderstood as cruelty. From a modern moral lens, sacrificing a lover appears vindictive, but the logic of the myth is not moral in that sense. It is structural. Dumuzi's failure was not disloyalty in love, but negligence in recognition. He enjoyed the benefits of power without honoring its source or cost. In a world governed by cycles, that imbalance could not stand. This judgment carried political weight. Kings were not meant to rule as if their authority were permanent. They were stewards, temporarily elevated by divine favor. Ritual mourning for Dumuzi reinforced this lesson annually. It reminded rulers and subjects alike that prosperity depended on acknowledgement of fragility. Denial invited collapse. The lamentations performed during Dumuzi's absence were not expressions of helpless grief. They were acts of participation. Women led these rituals, voicing sorrow in structured communal forms. Their cries named loss so that loss would not harden into oblivion. Grief, in this context, was labor. It sustained the cycle. Inanna emerges from this episode transformed. She is no longer simply the goddess who takes what she desires. She becomes the enforcer of rhythm. Her power now includes the authority to demand mourning, to require recognition of absence as the price of return. She does not soften. She becomes more precise. The underworld remains intact. Ereshkigal retains her throne. Death has not been weakened. What has changed is the relationship between realms. Passage is possible, but only under strict conditions. Substitution, rotation, and balance replace conquest. Inanna's descent taught her that domination ends at the threshold of death. Her ascent taught her that survival requires structure. She returns carrying that lesson into the living world, embedding it in seasons, rituals, and kingship itself. From this point on, her presence always implies cost. Desire promises fulfillment, but demands payment. Power grants elevation, but requires acknowledgement of loss. Inanna does not offer escape from these truths. She governs them. Life resumes under her gaze, but it does so with memory. Fields grow again. Lovers reunite. Songs replace laments. Yet beneath every celebration lies the knowledge that return is never free. The goddess who came back from death did not bring immortality. She brought order shaped by absence, and so the world continues. Not because death was defeated, but because it was given its due. With the cycle of descent and return fixed into the structure of the world, Inanna's authority entered a new phase. She was no longer only the goddess who ignited desire or unleashed violence. She became the force that bound human power to cosmic rhythm. Kingship, which had once relied on conquest and lineage, now required continual renewal through her favor. To rule without her was to rule without future. The sacred marriage ritual crystallized this relationship. It was not a private devotion, but a public act that fused politics, sexuality, and cosmology into a single moment. Each year, as the calendar turned and the land waited for renewal, the king of the city assumed the role of Dumuzi. This was not symbolic theater. It was transformation. Through ritual preparation, fasting, purification, and song, the king stepped out of ordinary identity and into mythic time. Inanna, embodied by her high priestess, did not represent submission. She represented selection. The ritual did not portray the goddess as a bride being claimed, but as a power choosing to descend. The priestess spoke in Inanna's voice, praising her own body, naming her desire, and summoning the king not as master, but as participant. Authority flowed from her acceptance, not his initiative. The sexual union at the center of the ritual was believed to activate fertility in every dimension. Fields would yield grain, herds would multiply, the city would prosper. This belief was not abstract faith, but experiential logic. When cycles aligned, when rains came and harvests followed, the ritual was confirmed. When famine or disorder struck, failure was interpreted as a rupture in alignment, a sign that the goddess had been neglected or dishonored. This placed immense pressure on rulers. To be favored by Inanna was to be elevated beyond challenge. To lose her favor was catastrophic. Kings praised her lavishly in inscriptions, calling themselves her beloved, her chosen, her shepherd. These declarations were not modest. They were claims to legitimacy that overrode rivals and justified rule. Yet embedded within this elevation was vulnerability. The king who became Dumuzi in ritual also inherited Dumuzi's fate. The myth was never hidden. Everyone knew the lover of Inanna was destined for descent. The ritual promised abundance, but it also marked the ruler as temporary. Power was intense but fragile. The goddess did not grant permanence. This tension shaped the psychology of kingship. Authority required confidence, but survival required humility. A king who ruled as if he were immortal invited disaster. Inanna's myths made this clear. Dumuzi's failure was not weakness, but blindness. He enjoyed power without acknowledging its source or cost. His descent served as warning. The annual lamentations reinforced this lesson. As summer heat scorched the land and growth stalled, mourning rituals filled the city. Women led these rites, voicing grief in stylized cries that named Dumuzi's suffering and absence. These were not spontaneous outbursts. They were structured performances that aligned human emotion with cosmic necessity. Through mourning, the community participated in maintaining balance. Grief was not passive. It was effective. To weep was to acknowledge loss, and acknowledgement allowed return. Inanna required this recognition. She did not accept denial or indifference. The land would not recover until absence was named. This emphasis on ritualized emotion set her apart from many other deities. Inanna did not demand stoic obedience. She demanded engagement. Love, grief, desire, and rage all belonged to her domain. To suppress them was to resist her order. To express them within ritual was to sustain life. Her influence extended beyond the royal sphere into everyday relationships. Contracts, oaths, and alliances often invoked her name alongside Utu's. Where Utu guaranteed justice through visibility, Inanna guaranteed commitment through attraction and consequence. Breaking a bond offended not only law, but desire itself. The punishment was not always legal. It could be social, emotional, or economic, unfolding through misfortune rather than decree. This made her particularly powerful in a world where written law was still developing. Social order depended on reputation, reciprocity, and fear of divine displeasure. Inanna's volatile nature reinforced compliance. She rewarded devotion generously, but she punished neglect without warning. Her unpredictability was not a flaw, it was deterrence. Over time, her cult absorbed additional functions. She became associated with music, dance, and performance, arts that move bodies and emotions. These were not trivial entertainments. They were technologies of synchronization, aligning individuals with collective rhythm. Inanna ruled moments when people moved together, whether in celebration or mourning. Her temples served as cultural hubs where ritual, economy, and art converged. Musicians, dancers, scribes, and craftsmen all worked under her patronage. Creativity itself was seen as an extension of her power, another form of transformation that reshaped reality. Despite this expansion, her core character remained intact. She did not become gentle or maternal with age. She remained demanding, restless, and unsatisfied. What changed was depth. The descent to the underworld added gravity to her desire. She no longer sought expansion without limit. She enforced cycles that preserved continuity through loss. This made her especially resonant in times of crisis. When cities faced invasion, famine, or internal collapse, her worship intensified. She understood catastrophe, she embodied it, and she promised not rescue, but survival through adaptation. Her myths did not offer comfort. They offered structure. Inanna's enduring power lay in this honesty. She did not pretend the world was fair or stable. She taught that life depends on engagement with forces that cannot be controlled, only honored. Desire must be expressed. Loss must be mourned. Power must be recognized as temporary. By binding kingship, fertility, ritual emotion, and cosmic rhythm together, Inanna became the organizing force of early civilization's inner life. She was not simply worshipped, she was enacted. Her stories were not distant legends, but instructions for living in a world where abundance and devastation shared the same roots. Through sacred marriage and seasonal mourning, through pleasure and pain, she shaped a society that understood survival as participation in cycles rather than escape from them. And in doing so, Inanna secured her place not just as a goddess of her time, but as one of the most complete expressions of power the ancient world ever conceived. The moment Inanna turned her desire toward Gilgamesh, the balance she enforced upon others snapped inward, exposing a fracture no ritual could smooth over. Gilgamesh was not an obscure mortal or a trembling supplicant. He was king of Uruk, her city, built upon her ground, raised beneath her star. He was also something unprecedented, a ruler who had tasted glory without her mediation and survived. That independence made him visible to her in a way devotion never could. Fresh from victory in the cedar forest, his body still marked by exertion and triumph, Gilgamesh radiated the kind of power Inanna recognized instantly. He had crossed boundaries, defied guardians, and returned alive. To her, this was not merely attractive, it was provocative. She approached him without subtlety, offering wealth, kingship reinforced by divine favor, supernatural protection, and herself. The offer was overwhelming by design. No king before him would have refused. Her promises were concrete, not romantic abstractions. She spoke of lapis and gold, of storm demons yoked to his chariot, of abundance in flocks and fields, of tribute from princes and rulers. This was the full package of divine sponsorship. To accept was to step into a lineage of sacred kings, to rule not merely by strength, but by erotic bond with the most powerful goddess of the age. Gilgamesh refused. The refusal itself was unprecedented, but the manner of it was catastrophic. He did not decline politely or invoke humility. He dismantled her offer piece by piece, reducing it to danger disguised as favor. He compared her gifts to unstable structures that collapse on those who trust them. Then he went further. He named her History. One by one, he listed her former lovers and the ends they met. Dumuzi, condemned to annual death. The shepherd turned into a wolf. The gardener transformed into a creature of the marsh. The lion trapped and destroyed. The horse broken by whip and goad. Each example sharpened the same accusation. proximity to Inanna ended in ruin, Gilgamesh did not deny her power. He exposed its cost. This speech was not only rejection, it was indictment. By voicing it publicly, Gilgamesh did something more dangerous than refusal. He challenged her narrative. He reframed her generosity as predation, her love as instability. For a goddess whose authority depended on desire freely given, this was intolerable. Inanna's response was immediate and volcanic. She did not argue. She ascended to the heavens and confronted her father, An, demanding the bull of heaven as weapon and punishment. The bull was not a mere beast. It was a cosmic force, embodiment of drought, famine, and seismic destruction. Releasing it was equivalent to unleashing environmental collapse. An hesitated. He warned her of the consequences. 7 years of famine would follow. Entire populations would suffer. Inanna dismissed the concern. She claimed preparation had been made, though the text offers no reassurance this was true. Her demand was not measured. It was absolute. Revenge outweighed consequence. The bull descended upon Uruk like a natural disaster given flesh. With each breath, it tore open the earth, swallowing men whole. The city reeled. Order dissolved into panic. This was not targeted punishment. It was indiscriminate devastation, the cost of wounded divinity spilling across innocent ground. Gilgamesh did not flee, nor did his companion Enkidu. Together they confronted the bull not as penitents but as challengers. Enkidu seized it. Gilgamesh struck it. The bull of heaven fell dead in the dust of the city it was meant to erase. Mortal strength, amplified by cooperation, overcame divine wrath. What followed was sacrilege layered upon defiance. One of the heroes tore a piece from the bull's corpse and hurled it toward Inanna, who watched from the city wall. The gesture was obscene, mocking, and public. It declared not only victory, but contempt. Inanna gathered her followers, the women, priestesses, and devotees who served her, and ordered mourning for the bull. Gilgamesh responded with celebration, displaying trophies and boasting of conquest. The city split symbolically between grief and triumph, between divine outrage and human pride. The gods convened to judge the offense. Killing the bull and insulting the goddess could not go unanswered. Someone must pay. Gilgamesh, protected by fate and partial divinity, was spared. Enkidu was chosen instead. His death did not come in battle. It came through illness and dream. As Enkidu weakened, he saw the underworld waiting, the place where all status dissolved. His death shattered Gilgamesh, forcing him to confront mortality not as abstraction, but as certainty. Inanna did not strike him directly, yet her rejection set the chain in motion. Desire denied became loss multiplied. This myth exposes a dimension of Inanna often softened by ritual and poetry. She is not a safe object of devotion. Her desire demands reciprocity, not autonomy. To reject her is not neutral. It destabilizes the order she sustains. Gilgamesh's refusal may have been rational, even wise, but it violated an expectation embedded in divine human relations. Gods offer, mortals accept. Anything else threatens structure. Yet the story refuses simple moral alignment. Inanna's rage is excessive. Her punishment devastates the innocent. Gilgamesh's critique is not false. The fates of her lovers are real. The gods themselves acknowledge fault on both sides. Power has been challenged. Boundaries have been crossed. What remains is consequence. Enkidu's death becomes the turning point of the epic. driving Gilgamesh into his futile search for immortality. Inanna fades from the narrative not as victor, but as catalyst. Her role is complete. She has enforced the cost of defiance without offering resolution. This episode reveals the limit of human independence in a world structured by divine desire. Gilgamesh can refuse a goddess, but he cannot escape the ripples that refusal sends through existence. Autonomy carries weight. It reshapes destiny. Inanna emerges neither villain nor victim. She is force reacting to resistance. Her love empowers, her anger destroys, and both operate without apology. In a world where gods and mortals share space uneasily, her presence defines the risk of saying no. The myth leaves no comfort. It leaves clarity. Desire binds. Rejection destabilizes. Power responds. And even heroes bleed when they stand alone beneath the stars she governs. As centuries passed and languages shifted, Inanna did not fade. She changed her name, her accents, and the symbols carved beside her image, but her core remained intact. When Akkadian speakers rose to dominance across Mesopotamia, they called her Ishtar. The syllables altered, but the force behind them did not. She moved effortlessly across cultural borders, absorbing new titles without surrendering authority. Where other gods became local or obsolete, she expanded. Under the Akkadians, and later the Babylonians and Assyrians, Ishtar became even more visibly political. Empires required gods who could justify conquest, inspire fear, and legitimize rule over diverse populations. Ishtar was perfectly suited to this role. She was already bilingual in contradiction, fluent in love and war, creation and annihilation. Empires thrive on the same dualities. Royal inscriptions increasingly emphasized her martial aspect. Kings claimed she marched before their armies, shattered enemy lines, and granted terror as a weapon. She was no longer only a city goddess. She became imperial, her star shining over territories that stretched far beyond the old Sumerian heartland. When Assyrian kings carved reliefs showing cities burned and captives led away, her name appeared not as apology, but as endorsement. Yet even as war imagery intensified, her erotic power did not diminish. In Assyrian hymns, she remained irresistible, dangerous, and desired. This coexistence unsettled later interpreters, but to the ancient mind, it remained coherent. Empire itself depended on attraction as much as force. Loyalty was won through reward and intimidation alike. Ishtar embodied both strategies in divine form. Her temples followed trade routes and military roads. From Anatolia to the Levant, shrines rose where her star had not been known before. Each region adapted her slightly. Local myths folded her into existing pantheons. Sometimes she merged with other goddesses, sometimes she eclipsed them. What mattered was not purity of tradition, but effectiveness. She worked. This adaptability did not mean dilution. On the contrary, her contradictions sharpened. In some regions, she appeared as a virgin warrior, untouched yet lethal. In others, she was overtly sexual, surrounded by cultic performers and sacred rites. These were not competing versions. They were situational expressions. The same goddess who inflamed desire could demand celibacy and service. Control over sexuality, not indulgence alone, was her domain. Her relationship with gender remained disruptive. Ishtar continued to preside over boundary-crossing identities, granting legitimacy to those who did not fit conventional roles. In Assyrian texts, she could strip masculinity from men or arm women for battle. Gender, like power, was something she redistributed at will. This capacity reinforced her association with transformation rather than stability. Astrally, her identification with Venus became increasingly systematized. Babylonian astronomer priests tracked the planet's movements with precision, recording its cycles, disappearances, and reappearances. These observations were not divorced from theology. Each phase of Venus corresponded to a mood, an omen, an aspect of the goddess. When she vanished from the sky, it recalled her descent. When she returned, it promised renewed potency. This cosmic regularity added a new layer to her authority. She was no longer only reactive, responding to human actions. She was predictive. Her movement signaled future events, especially those related to kingship and war. Empires watched her star carefully, reading fate in its brightness or absence. In this way, she governed not only present desire, but anticipated outcome. Despite this elevation, her myths retained unease. She never became morally reassuring. Stories continued to portray her as volatile, quick to anger, generous and destructive in equal measure. This consistency mattered. Empires depended on fear as much as trust. A god who could not be offended would not compel obedience. Ishtar's unpredictability preserved her relevance. As Mesopotamian influence spread, echoes of her appeared in neighboring cultures. In the Levant, goddesses like Astarte carried similar traits. In Anatolia, she merged with local warrior deities. These figures shared her star, her sexuality, her ferocity. They were not copies but reflections, shaped by different landscapes and social needs. The pattern remained recognizable. Even traditions that rejected Mesopotamian religion could not entirely erase her shadow. Later texts preserved fragments of her cult in hostile tones, condemning rituals associated with her as foreign or dangerous. These condemnations reveal endurance, not weakness. What persists long enough to be attacked has already proven its power. Her legacy also shaped how divinity itself was imagined. Inanna Ishtar demonstrated that a goddess could dominate without maternity, rule without subordination, and desire without apology. She did not exist to support male gods or human heroes. She drove narratives. Others reacted. This autonomy influenced later conceptions of divine femininity, even where direct continuity cannot be proven. The idea that creative power could be violent, that attraction could be authoritative, that love could destroy as effectively as it nurtured, entered the deep structure of myth. What ultimately secured her survival was not conquest or beauty alone, but relevance. Inanna Ishtar spoke to realities that did not vanish with technological change or political reform. Cities still required desire to function, violence to defend, cycles to endure. Empires still relied on charisma and terror. Human beings still experienced attraction as destabilizing force rather than gentle comfort. She was never reduced to metaphor. She remained operational. Her stories explained why success carried risk, why intimacy invited loss, why power demanded acknowledgement of forces beyond control. In that sense, she outlived her temples. She became a grammar of experience. By the time Mesopotamian civilization itself faded into ruin, her name was already embedded in others. She had crossed linguistic borders, theological systems, and moral frameworks without surrendering essence. Few gods achieved that kind of continuity. Inanna began as a presence in mud-brick cities beside unpredictable rivers. She ended as a cosmic principle inscribed in stars and empires. The journey did not tame her. It amplified her. and long after her worship ceased, the world she helped shape continued to move according to patterns she once enforced. Desire rising, power colliding, loss returning as renewal, and nothing precious existing without cost. As Inanna's worship stretched across centuries, her presence settled into the deep mechanics of how people understood order itself. She was no longer only encountered in myth or ritual, but embedded in the assumptions that governed law, oath, magic, and consequence. To invoke her name was not simply to call upon a goddess, it was to activate a system in which desire, authority, and retribution were inseparable. In legal contexts, her influence appeared beside that of Utu, the sun god of justice. Where Utu represented exposure and truth, Inanna represented commitment and consequence. Contracts sworn under her name carried an implicit warning. To break an agreement was not merely unlawful, it was an act of betrayal against a force that bound people through attraction and obligation. Punishment might not come immediately, but it would come obliquely, through loss of favor, instability, or misfortune that seemed personal rather than judicial. This made her especially potent in a society where enforcement mechanisms were limited. Written law existed, but surveillance did not. Social cohesion relied on fear of divine response as much as human authority. Inanna's reputation for volatility filled that gap. People believed she noticed imbalance and responded without warning. This belief shaped behavior more effectively than distant punishment. Her association with magic followed the same logic. Spells and incantations invoking her were not requests for comfort. They were attempts to redirect force. Love charms, curses, and rituals of attraction often carried her name, acknowledging that desire itself was not neutral. To influence it required negotiation with the goddess who ruled its currents. Practitioners did not ask her to soften hearts gently. They asked her to turn attention, disrupt resistance, and bind outcomes. This proximity to manipulation gave her an ambiguous reputation. She was not a moral guardian. She did not reward virtue for its own sake. She rewarded alignment. Those who understood her patterns could thrive. Those who ignored them suffered. The distinction mattered. Inanna did not enforce ethical purity. She enforced balance through intensity. Her myths reflect this indifference to moral comfort. She punishes without explanation. She rewards without justification. Outcomes follow action, but not in predictable ways. This unpredictability was not chaos, it was excess. Her responses exceeded expectation, reinforcing caution and reverence. Over time, theologians attempted to systematize her. Lists of her epithets multiplied, each name capturing a facet of her power. Lady of Battle, Queen of Heaven, Mistress of Desire, Light of the Morning, Terror of Nations. These were not poetic redundancies. They were functional distinctions, invoked in different contexts depending on need. One goddess, many modes. This multiplicity allowed her to coexist with evolving religious structures. As pantheons grew more hierarchical, with male gods elevated to supreme authority, Inanna Ishtar retained independence by occupying necessary contradictions. She could not be subordinated without destabilizing the system. Even when positioned as consort or daughter, her actions contradicted dependency. She continued to act on her own initiative. Attempts to domesticate her image often failed. When traditions emphasized her sexuality alone, her warlike nature resurfaced. When her martial role was highlighted, her erotic power reasserted itself. she resisted reduction. This resistance ensured her relevance across contexts that demanded different divine functions. Her influence on ritual time was equally persistent. Calendars marked festivals associated with her star, her descent, her return. These observances regulated agricultural and political cycles alike. Time itself became textured by her story. Periods of celebration and mourning alternated not arbitrarily, but according to her mythic rhythm. Even as new gods rose to prominence, her festivals endured. They were adaptable, absorbing new meanings without losing core structure. Mourning for Dumuzi, celebration of return, renewal of kingship. These themes remained intelligible even as theology shifted. They addressed experiences that did not vanish with reform. Her endurance also owed much to the way her myths refused closure. They did not resolve tension, they maintained it. Inanna's stories end with cycles continuing, not problems solved. Death remains. Desire returns. Power shifts. This open-endedness allowed each generation to find itself within the narrative, rather than outside it. As Mesopotamian influence waned, her figure did not disappear cleanly. Fragments lingered in neighboring cultures, sometimes stripped of context, sometimes reinterpreted as threat. Later religious traditions that sought moral clarity found her troubling. She did not fit systems built on obedience or transcendence. She insisted on immanence, on forces that operate within life rather than above it. Texts that condemned her cult inadvertently preserved its memory. By naming practices associated with her as dangerous or forbidden, they acknowledged their persistence. The need to suppress indicated continued attraction. Desire does not yield easily to decree. Inanna's legacy thus survives less as doctrine than as pattern. She represents the understanding that power is not static, that attraction binds and endangers, that authority requires recognition of loss. These insights did not vanish when her temples fell. They migrated into political theory, psychology, and art long after her name ceased to be spoken in prayer. Her refusal to conform to moral binaries made her difficult to inherit, but impossible to erase. She was not good or evil, she was effective. That effectiveness shaped civilizations more reliably than virtue ever could. In the end, Inanna's significance lies not in her antiquity, but in her accuracy. She articulated a truth about human systems that remains uncomfortable, that what draws us together can also destroy us. That order depends on intensity, and that balance is maintained not through restraint alone, but through acknowledgement of excess. She stood at the center of the first cities, because cities themselves are expressions of desire constrained by structure. They thrive on attraction, competition, accumulation, and risk. Inanna named these forces and refused to apologize for them. Even now, when her temples are dust and her hymns fragmentary, the patterns she embodied persist. Power still seduces, desire still destabilizes, loss still renews, and nothing built to last escapes the cycles she once ruled. Inanna does not belong to the past alone. She belongs wherever systems rise on longing and survive on consequence. As the great cities of Mesopotamia aged and their walls cracked under new empires, Inanna's presence retreated from stone and ritual into memory. But memory proved more durable than brick. She no longer needed temples to function. Her logic had already been absorbed into how people understood power, desire, and survival. Even as political authority reorganized itself under distant gods and centralized rule, the patterns she embodied continued to shape behavior beneath the surface. One of the most enduring traces of her influence lay in how societies interpreted catastrophe. Floods, famine, military defeat, and sudden loss were rarely seen as random events. They were read as signs of imbalance, moments when forces had been neglected, denied, or mishandled. Inanna's myths provided a grammar for these experiences. Excess led to collapse. Denial led to punishment. Mourning enabled return. These ideas did not require belief in her as a named deity to remain operational. As later traditions emphasized moral law and singular divine authority, Inanna's refusal to conform became a problem. She could not be reduced to allegory without losing meaning. She did not represent virtue or vice. She represented intensity. Systems built on obedience and transcendence struggled to accommodate a goddess whose power was immanent, emotional, and unpredictable. The solution was not erasure, but displacement. Her attributes migrated: love separated from war, fertility detached from death, justice distanced itself from desire. These divisions made theology cleaner, but they did not reflect lived experience. The forces remained entangled in reality, even if they were disentangled in doctrine. Inanna survived in the gaps between categories, where theory failed to match life. This survival is visible in later mythic figures, who carry fragments of her essence without inheriting her name. Warrior goddesses, dangerous lovers, sovereign queens whose sexuality threatened order, all echo aspects of her. They appear across cultures as warnings and fascinations, often punished within narrative frameworks that sought to restore control. Yet their very persistence indicates unresolved tension. Inanna's logic resisted closure. Her influence also persisted in the symbolic use of descent as transformation. Journeys into darkness followed by altered return became a recurring motif, whether framed as spiritual trial, psychological ordeal, or heroic initiation. These narratives rarely promised victory without cost. They insisted on stripping away status, identity, and illusion before renewal could occur. This structure mirrors her descent with remarkable fidelity, even when explicit references vanished. In political thought, the idea that authority must periodically confront vulnerability remained powerful. Leaders were expected to demonstrate humility, acknowledge loss, or suffer downfall. Ceremonies of abasement, public confession, or symbolic death appear across cultures as mechanisms to reset legitimacy. These practices echo the lesson embedded in Inanna's judgment of Dumuzi. Power unacknowledged corrodes itself. In personal relationships, her legacy surfaced in the understanding of love as destabilizing force. Romance was not always framed as sanctuary. It was portrayed as risk, obsession, and potential ruin. Literature and art returned repeatedly to figures who loved intensely and paid for it. The notion that passion demands sacrifice did not originate in later moralism. It was ancient, structural, and deeply Inanna-shaped. Her connection to gender fluidity also left a quiet imprint. While later societies often suppressed non-conforming identities, the association between sacred power and boundary crossing did not disappear. Figures who existed between categories continued to appear as liminal, prophetic, or dangerous. They were feared and revered in equal measure, echoing Inanna's own position at the edge of order. Even the language of stars retained her shadow. Venus continued to be read as omen, associated with love, conflict, and transformation. Long after mythic explanation gave way to astronomy, the planet's symbolism persisted. It remained charged with meaning disproportionate to its physical presence, a reminder that observation alone does not erase narrative weight. Inanna's disappearance from formal worship did not mark failure. It marked completion. Her function had been fulfilled. She had encoded a way of understanding systems that no longer required her name to operate. When later traditions condemned excess, warned against desire, or feared unrestrained power, they reacted to conditions she had articulated, not invented. Her myths endure because they do not instruct obedience. They describe mechanics. They show how forces behave when unleashed or denied. They refuse consolation. This makes them resilient. Comfort fades with circumstance. Structure remains. In modern terms, Inanna might be described as a theory of complexity given form. She embodies the insight that systems grow through tension, not harmony, that suppression intensifies what it seeks to eliminate, and that renewal requires confrontation with loss. These ideas continue to appear in fields far removed from ancient religion, from political theory to psychology, from ecology to art. Her refusal to offer redemption without cost sets her apart from later salvific figures. She does not promise escape from death or suffering. She promises continuity through cycle. What ends will return differently. What is denied will resurface distorted. What is acknowledged can be transformed. This worldview does not flatter human desire for control. It humbles it. That humility, once learned, does not vanish easily. It shapes expectation, caution, and respect for forces beyond management. Inanna began as a goddess of a single city. She became a logic of civilization. When cities fell and names changed, the logic remained. Desire still binds people into systems they cannot fully master. Power still demands recognition of its limits. Loss still conditions renewal. The silence around her name in later centuries does not mark forgetting. It marks assimilation. She no longer needed priests to speak for her. Her patterns spoke themselves, written into the rise and collapse of every structure that followed. In that sense, Inanna never truly left history. She simply ceased to be visible as a figure and became visible as a pattern. And patterns, once learned, do not die. When the ancient world began to reinterpret the divine through more rigid moral frameworks, Inanna's presence became increasingly difficult to reconcile. She was too immanent, too emotional, too willing to cross lines that newer systems insisted must remain fixed. As societies moved toward centralized authority and singular divine order, the forces she represented did not disappear, but they were reframed, restricted, and often feared. In cultures that inherited fragments of her influence, desire was no longer openly acknowledged as sacred power. It became something to be regulated, redirected, or suppressed. Yet suppression did not eliminate it. It intensified it. Inanna's logic asserted itself precisely where restraint failed. Obsession, jealousy, and destructive love stories multiplied, suggesting that what had once been ritualized was now unmanaged. Without a goddess to contain it, desire spilled into narrative as tragedy. Her warlike aspect followed a similar path. Earlier cultures accepted that violence and fertility were linked, that expansion required destruction. Later traditions attempted to moralize warfare, framing it as justified or condemned rather than inevitable. Yet empires continued to rise through force. The dissonance between doctrine and reality grew sharper. Inanna's unapologetic embodiment of violence no longer fit, but the violence itself persisted, stripped of divine acknowledgement, yet no less real. This tension produced new mythic strategies. Figures resembling Inanna were often split into opposing archetypes, the pure and the corrupt, the nurturing and the destructive. By dividing what she had once unified, later narratives created clarity at the expense of honesty. The result was moral simplification that failed to account for lived complexity. Yet even within these divided frameworks, traces of her unity remained. Female figures associated with forbidden knowledge, sexual autonomy, or battlefield ferocity continued to appear. They were often punished within stories, portrayed as warnings rather than guides. Their fate revealed anxiety, not resolution. The need to control what they represented never fully succeeded. In philosophical traditions, especially those concerned with order and reason, Inanna's worldview posed a challenge. She resisted abstraction. Her power was experiential, felt in the body and the collective, rather than deduced logically. Systems that privileged reason over emotion struggled to incorporate her without distortion. As a result, emotion itself became suspect, framed as obstacle rather than force. This marginalization had consequences. By denying the legitimacy of desire and grief as structuring forces, societies lost ritual mechanisms for managing them. Emotional extremes did not vanish. They resurfaced as instability, rebellion, and private suffering. Inanna's absence was not neutral. It created vacuum. The pattern repeated across eras. Whenever cultures attempted to eliminate contradiction in favor of purity, suppressed forces returned in distorted form. Passion became obsession. Authority became tyranny. Mourning became unresolved trauma. These outcomes echoed the ancient warnings embedded in Inanna's myths. Denial does not neutralize power. It displaces it. In literature, her shadow remained visible in characters who embodied dangerous attraction. Lovers whose presence destabilized order. Queens whose ambition threatened kings. Women whose autonomy provoked fear. These figures were rarely allowed to survive unscathed. Narrative punishment replaced ritual containment. The cycle continued, but without balance. Even in religious systems that rejected polytheism, the structure of descent and return persisted. Spiritual journeys framed as trials, purifications, or dark nights of the soul mirrored Inanna's path. Status was stripped away. Identity collapsed. Return followed only after surrender. Though reinterpreted, the pattern remained unmistakable. In psychological terms, this descent began to be understood as confrontation with the unconscious, the buried forces shaping behavior. Modern language changed, but the experience did not. Encounters with loss, desire, and mortality continued to strip individuals of certainty before renewal. Inanna's story proved adaptable because it described process rather than doctrine. Her legacy also shaped how societies understood time. Linear progress promised by later ideologies often failed to account for regression and repetition. Inanna's cyclical model offered a different insight, that progress and decline are intertwined, that return is not reversal but transformation. This perspective resurfaced whenever linear narratives collapsed under reality. Politically, revolutions echoed her logic. Periods of excess led to collapse. Collapse demanded reckoning. New structures emerged carrying the memory of what failed. Leaders who ignored this rhythm repeated the mistakes of Dumuzi, enjoying power without acknowledging cost. Their downfall followed. Inanna's myths warned against such blindness, not through moral sermon but through consequence. Her authority lay in inevitability rather than command. Forces ignored became forces unleashed. This lesson remained applicable long after her worship ended. Her absence from formal theology did not mean irrelevance. It meant invisibility. She became the unspoken assumption behind recurring patterns. Whenever societies struggled to reconcile desire with order, ambition with mortality, or power with vulnerability, they reenacted her logic unconsciously. In this way, Inanna transformed from deity into diagnostic. Her myths functioned as tools for understanding failure and renewal. They offered no solutions, only recognition. Recognition itself became the means of survival. The persistence of her patterns suggests that ancient myth was not primitive explanation, but compressed insight. Inanna articulated dynamics that later systems repeatedly rediscovered under different names. Each rediscovery confirmed the same truth: that human structures cannot escape the forces that bind them, only negotiate with them. Her story endures because it does not resolve tension, it preserves it. That preservation allows societies to confront complexity without denial. Where myths promised salvation, hers promised continuity. Where others offered certainty, she offered rhythm. Inanna's voice no longer speaks through hymns, but it echoes in cycles of collapse and rebirth, in love that transforms and destroys, in power that demands acknowledgement of loss. She remains present wherever intensity governs outcome. What she represented was never limited to belief. It was embedded in experience, and experience does not forget what belief abandons. Long after temples fell silent and priests stopped reciting her hymns, Inanna continued to surface wherever human systems strained under their own weight. She appeared not as a named goddess, but as a recognizable pattern, emerging in moments when desire overwhelmed restraint and power exceeded its limits. Her logic revealed itself most clearly in collapse, when structures built on certainty fractured and exposed what had been denied. Civilizations that followed Mesopotamia often imagined themselves more refined, more rational, more controlled. Yet their histories repeated familiar arcs. Expansion driven by ambition led to concentration of power. Concentration bred excess. Excess invited instability. When collapse came, it was rarely understood as internal consequence. Blame was externalized. Enemies, fate, corruption, or divine punishment were invoked. But beneath these explanations lay the same mechanics Inanna's myths had already articulated. She taught that systems fail not because desire exists, but because it is mismanaged. Suppression does not remove intensity, it distorts it. Inanna's world acknowledged this openly. Later worlds pretended otherwise. The result was repetition without understanding. In political history, figures resembling Dumuzi appeared again and again. Leaders rose through charisma, conquest, or inheritance, enjoying privilege without recognizing the forces that enabled it. They mistook favor for permanence. When crisis arrived, their refusal to acknowledge vulnerability accelerated downfall. Their removal often restored balance, though at terrible cost. The pattern did not require belief in gods. It required only human behavior. Revolutions followed similar logic. Excessive control provoked rebellion. Rebellion destroyed order. Out of destruction emerged new structures that promised renewal. These cycles echoed Inanna's descent and return, stripped of divine narrative but identical in motion. Each phase required stripping away identity before reconstruction. Each return carried scars. In personal life, her presence persisted through the language of transformation. Intense relationships continued to be described as consuming, overwhelming, even annihilating. People spoke of losing themselves in love, being destroyed by passion, or reborn through loss. These metaphors were not accidental. They described experiences that followed the same trajectory as her myths: attraction, surrender, dissolution, and altered return. Art and literature repeatedly returned to this structure. Characters descended into darkness, lost status, identity, or certainty, and emerged changed. The descent was never optional. It was imposed by excess or denial. Redemption, when it came, did not restore the past. It produced something different, often less innocent but more aware. This persistence suggests that Inanna's story was never meant to be confined to theology. It functioned as an early articulation of systemic behavior. She personified forces that modern thought often treats abstractly: feedback loops, thresholds, instability, and renewal. By giving them form, she made them intelligible. Her refusal to be morally consistent frustrated later interpreters. She punished devotion and rewarded audacity. She destroyed what she loved and preserved what she judged necessary. Yet this inconsistency mirrors reality more closely than moral clarity. Systems rarely respond proportionally. They respond dramatically once limits are crossed. Inanna's myths do not encourage obedience. They encourage awareness. They show what happens when forces are ignored or misused. This made them dangerous to traditions that relied on compliance rather than comprehension. A goddess who cannot be appeased through submission alone undermines authoritarian certainty. Her association with femininity intensified this threat. A powerful female figure who governed desire, violence, and transformation without maternal framing contradicted later ideals that sought to confine feminine power to nurture or restraint. As a result, echoes of Inanna were often cast as temptresses, witches, or destroyers, figures to be feared rather than understood. Yet fear preserved memory. The more societies attempted to control what she represented, the more distorted her reflection became. Desire turned monstrous. Power became demonic. Transformation was framed as corruption. These distortions did not erase her logic. They testified to its persistence. In psychological language, her descent became the encounter with shadow, the confrontation with aspects of self that resist integration. Avoidance intensified symptoms. Engagement allowed transformation. This framework, developed millennia later, mirrored her myth with remarkable fidelity. The underworld was not a place of evil. It was a place of truth, stripped of ornament. Inanna's story insisted that identity is conditional. Strip away symbols, status, and recognition, and what remains must still survive. This lesson applied to gods and humans alike. It undermined fantasies of invulnerability. It demanded humility. Her influence also shaped how loss was understood. Mourning was not weakness, but process. Grief allowed return. Denial prolonged absence. Cultures that ritualized mourning navigated loss more coherently than those that suppressed it. Inanna required grief as participation in cycle. Without it, renewal stalled. As modern societies grappled with rapid change, industrialization, and abstraction, the absence of such rituals became noticeable. Crises accumulated without resolution. Renewal lagged. Systems oscillated between excess and collapse without integrating loss. Inanna's logic remained applicable but unacknowledged. This unacknowledged presence explains why ancient myths continue to resonate even when belief fades. They describe behavior, not doctrine. Inanna survives because the forces she embodied did not vanish with technological advancement. Desire, ambition, and mortality remain constants. Her story challenges the assumption that progress eliminates primitive patterns. It suggests instead that patterns persist and reappear in new forms. The task is not eradication, but recognition. Without recognition, repetition continues blindly. Inanna's endurance across millennia is not accidental. She articulated a truth about systems that resist simplification. Balance is not stasis. It is movement regulated through consequence. Power must cycle. Desire must be acknowledged. Loss must be honored. Where these principles are ignored, collapse follows. Where they are recognized, renewal becomes possible, though never painless. This is not optimism. It is realism. Inanna's legacy is not comfort. It is clarity. She does not promise stability. She explains instability. She does not offer salvation. She offers continuity through change. As long as human beings build systems driven by desire and constrained by limits, her pattern will remain visible. Names change, symbols shift, the logic endures. In that endurance lies her final power. She no longer requires belief to operate. She requires only life, unfolding as it always has, in cycles she once ruled openly and now governs silently. When belief systems hardened and authority demanded certainty, the kind of truth Inanna represented became increasingly uncomfortable. She belonged to a world that accepted contradiction as structural, not accidental. Later ages preferred coherence, hierarchy, and moral clarity. Yet history itself refused to comply. In moments when systems strained past tolerance, her pattern resurfaced, revealing that contradiction had never been resolved, only concealed. Civilizations that imagined themselves governed by law alone eventually encountered forces law could not restrain. Desire ignored statute. Ambition bypassed ethics. Grief shattered discipline. In these moments, the language used to describe crisis echoed ancient imagery. Societies spoke of decay, corruption, falling into darkness, and the need for renewal. These were not metaphors invented anew. They were inherited structures of meaning, carrying the residue of Inanna's descent and return. The modern tendency to treat collapse as anomaly rather than outcome obscured this inheritance. Failure was framed as deviation from progress, not as consequence of excess. Inanna's myths refused such denial. They asserted that growth unchecked leads inevitably to rupture. This assertion did not rely on prophecy. It relied on observation. Empires that rose with promises of permanence eventually fractured under their own weight. Administrative complexity turned brittle. Concentrated power alienated participation. Prosperity widened inequality. When these tensions erupted, leaders often responded with suppression rather than recognition. The result was escalation. Violence intensified. Systems imploded. Inanna's logic predicted this outcome without moralizing it. She did not condemn ambition. She contextualized it. Expansion without cycle invited collapse. Collapse without mourning prevented renewal. The sequence was not punitive. It was mechanical. This mechanical understanding of consequence set her apart from moral gods who rewarded obedience and punished transgression. Inanna punished imbalance, regardless of intention. Good intentions did not mitigate excess. Ignorance did not excuse denial. This impartiality made her terrifying, but also reliable. One could predict outcomes by reading conditions rather than guessing divine mood. Her displacement from theology coincided with the rise of linear narratives promising permanent improvement. These narratives struggled when confronted with regression. Each crisis required reinterpretation, often blamed on moral failure or external threat. Rarely was the structure itself questioned. Inanna's myths would have questioned it immediately. Her absence also reshaped how societies handled grief. As ritual mourning declined, loss became privatized or suppressed. Collective acknowledgement faded. The result was unresolved trauma that lingered beneath public life. Cycles of violence and revenge intensified as grief found no sanctioned release. Inanna's requirement for mourning had served as pressure valve. Without it, pressure accumulated. This accumulation manifested culturally. Art, literature, and philosophy grew darker, more preoccupied with despair and alienation. Descent narratives proliferated, but without return. The underworld became terminal rather than transitional. This shift marked the loss of Inanna's balance. Descent without structure becomes annihilation. Even in secular frameworks, the same pattern emerged. Economic booms followed by crashes. Political movements surged and collapsed. Ideologies promised resolution but delivered repetition. Each cycle carried greater intensity, as lessons remained unintegrated. Inanna's myth had warned against exactly this blindness. Her logic also exposed the fragility of control. Systems built to eliminate risk often amplified it. Regulation without recognition of desire drove behavior underground. Suppression created distortion. Inanna understood desire as force requiring channel, not denial. Later systems preferred denial, mistaking silence for absence. This misunderstanding shaped attitudes toward power. Leaders who projected invulnerability discouraged acknowledgement of failure. Admission of weakness became taboo. When collapse came, it was catastrophic. Inanna's myths insisted on periodic stripping of status precisely to prevent such outcomes. Humiliation was not disgrace, it was maintenance. The refusal to accept this maintenance transformed humility into shame. Shame paralyzed response. Crisis deepened. The cycle accelerated. In personal psychology, similar dynamics unfolded. Individuals trained to suppress grief, desire, or anger experienced fragmentation. Unexpressed forces returned as anxiety, obsession, or despair. Therapeutic frameworks that emphasized confrontation with buried material rediscovered Inanna's descent in different language. Healing required dissent, acknowledgement, and integration. Avoidance perpetuated suffering. Inanna's continued relevance lies here. She offers not solutions, but diagnostics. She reveals where imbalance exists and what process it demands. She does not promise comfort. She promises continuity if conditions are met. Her absence from explicit belief allowed her logic to operate invisibly. Patterns repeated without recognition. Each repetition confirmed the same insight: that systems ignoring cycle collapse harder than those honoring it. The modern obsession with optimization echoes ancient hubris. Efficiency replaces ritual, speed replaces reflection, growth replaces sustainability. These substitutions mirror Dumuzi's failure, enjoying power without mourning its cost. The outcome remains predictable. Inanna's story does not argue against growth. It argues for rhythm. It does not oppose desire. It demands its acknowledgement. It does not deny power. it insists on its periodic undoing. Where this undoing is ritualized, renewal occurs with less destruction. Where it is resisted, destruction substitutes ritual. The choice is not between cycle and stasis. It is between conscious and unconscious cycle. Inanna's myths taught this openly. Later cultures learned it painfully. Her disappearance from temples marked the beginning of a long experiment in denial. That experiment has not ended. Each crisis tests whether recognition will finally replace resistance. Inanna does not return as goddess. She returns as consequence. She appears whenever systems reach breaking point, whenever desire overwhelms restraint, whenever power forgets mortality. She is present in collapse, not as cause, but as explanation. Her logic does not judge. It reveals. As long as human beings build structures that ignore their own limits, her pattern will remain operative. Collapse will continue to function as correction. Renewal will require descent. In this sense, Inanna has outlived belief itself. She governs not because she is worshipped, but because the world still behaves as she once described it. Her final authority is not mythic. It is structural. And structures do not fade when names are forgotten. At the far edge of remembrance, where myth dissolves into pattern and pattern into behavior, Inanna remains most visible in what societies struggle to name. She is present wherever systems reach saturation, wherever intensity outpaces structure, wherever denial becomes unsustainable. Her power no longer appears as divine intervention, but as inevitability. What was once narrated through gods is now enacted through consequence. Modern cultures often pride themselves on having outgrown myth, yet they continue to reenact it unconsciously. Desire is marketed, amplified, accelerated. Power is centralized, abstracted, insulated. Loss is postponed, hidden, or reframed as failure rather than process. These tendencies do not negate Inanna's logic. They confirm it. The more her patterns are denied, the more violently they assert themselves. Economic systems provide a clear example. Periods of unchecked expansion generate euphoria, confidence, and belief in permanence. Risk is ignored. Limits are dismissed as outdated. When collapse arrives, it is treated as anomaly, blamed on individual actors or unforeseen events. Yet the structure repeats with precision. Excess produces instability. Instability demands correction. Correction arrives as destruction. This sequence mirrors the ancient cycle without mythic language. Inanna's world would have recognized the warning signs early. Surplus without ritual acknowledgement invited imbalance. Power without humility required stripping. Mourning was not optional. It was preventive. Modern systems lack such mechanisms. Collapse substitutes ritual, inflicting what recognition could have mitigated. The same dynamic operates politically. Authority that presents itself as absolute discourages dissent and suppresses vulnerability. This creates fragility. When pressure exceeds tolerance, collapse is sudden and extreme. Revolutions erupt not because desire appears, but because it was denied too long. Inanna's logic again unfolds, indifferent to ideology. In cultural life, the suppression of grief has proven especially destructive. Societies that avoid collective mourning struggle to integrate trauma. Loss accumulates without resolution. Anger seeks outlet. Violence becomes substitute for lament. Inanna's insistence on mourning as structural necessity stands in stark contrast. She understood grief as function, not weakness. Her myths framed mourning as action that enabled return. Without it, cycles stalled. Modern avoidance of grief prolongs crisis. Healing becomes elusive. This is not failure of empathy, but failure of structure. In personal experience, the same patterns repeat. Individuals who deny desire or suppress loss often encounter breakdown. Burnout, depression, and obsession emerge not as moral failings, but as systemic responses to imbalance. Therapeutic models that emphasize confrontation with buried material echo Inanna's descent, whether acknowledged or not. The descent is never comfortable. It strips identity, status, and illusion. Yet without it, return is impossible. This insight has reappeared across disciplines, from psychology to ecology, each rediscovering what Inanna's myth made explicit. Systems regenerate only through confrontation with limits. Inanna's enduring relevance lies in her refusal to offer escape. She does not promise transcendence. She promises continuity through cycle. This makes her incompatible with narratives of salvation that seek to bypass suffering. She insists that suffering be integrated, not avoided. This insistence has made her unpopular across eras. Cultures prefer gods who reassure, justify, or absolve. Inanna does none of these. She exposes, she destabilizes, she demands recognition of forces people would rather control silently. Yet exposure is precisely what enables survival. Her displacement from formal belief has not reduced her influence. It has dispersed it. She appears wherever feedback loops tighten, wherever growth accelerates beyond capacity, wherever denial accumulates. She is not invoked. She is encountered. The language used to describe modern crises unconsciously borrows her imagery. Societies speak of collapse, rebirth, reckoning, and transformation. These terms reflect a deep memory of cyclical process. The mythic vocabulary persists because the experience persists. Inanna's story also challenges the fantasy of moral superiority over the past. Modern systems repeat ancient errors with greater scale and speed. Technology amplifies intensity, but does not change structure. Desire remains force. Power remains volatile. Loss remains unavoidable. What changes is visibility. Ancient myths named these forces openly. Modern frameworks often disguise them behind metrics and abstraction. The disguise fails under stress. Reality reasserts itself. In this sense, Inanna represents an ancient form of realism. She did not moralize intensity. She contextualized it. She did not seek to eliminate contradiction. She organized it. Her myths served as maintenance manuals for complex systems long before complexity theory existed. The absence of such manuals does not free systems from complexity. It renders them blind to it. Blindness increases damage. Inanna's endurance suggests that myths function not as explanations of nature, but as compressed models of behavior. They survive when they describe reality accurately. She survives because her model remains valid. As human systems grow increasingly interconnected and accelerated, the cost of ignoring cycle intensifies. Collapse becomes global rather than local. Renewal becomes harder. Inanna's logic does not change. The stakes do. Her story does not offer hope in the modern sense. It offers warning and instruction. Recognize desire. Acknowledge loss. Distribute power. Allow dissent before collapse enforces it. These instructions are not comforting. They are effective. Inanna does not return as belief because belief is unnecessary. Her patterns operate regardless. The question is not whether she matters, but whether recognition will arrive before consequence. She remains present wherever intensity governs outcome. She governs not through worship, but through structure. She cannot be appeased, only understood. At the end of her long journey from goddess to pattern, Inanna stands not behind us, but within us, shaping responses to excess, denial, and loss. Her authority is not ancient, it is continuous. And as long as human beings continue to build systems fueled by desire and constrained by limits, her cycle will remain active, whether named or not. At the furthest horizon of this long arc, where gods have dissolved into abstractions and abstractions into systems, Inanna's presence remains as a quiet but relentless truth. She no longer needs myth to announce herself. She manifests wherever intensity exceeds containment, wherever desire outruns structure, wherever power forgets its dependence on loss. Her authority has not weakened with time. It has become invisible, and invisibility has made it stronger. The ancient world spoke her name because it recognized what she governed. The modern world often avoids naming the same forces, preferring neutrality, metrics, or ideology. Yet the avoidance changes nothing. Desire still organizes behavior. Power still concentrates and destabilizes. Loss still demands recognition. The cycle continues, indifferent to belief. Inanna's final lesson is not theological, it is structural. She reveals that systems collapse not because they are evil, but because they deny their own mechanics. Growth without rhythm produces fracture. Control without humility produces rebellion. Love without acknowledgement of cost produces ruin. These outcomes do not require divine intervention. They emerge naturally. Her myths did not warn against ambition or passion. They warned against forgetting consequence. Inanna never punished desire itself. She punished blindness. Dumuzi did not descend because he ruled. He descended because he ruled as if loss did not apply to him. Gilgamesh did not suffer because he refused her. He suffered because refusal disrupted balance without providing alternative structure. These distinctions matter. They reveal a goddess who does not demand submission, only awareness. Awareness is not passive. It requires action, mourning, redistribution, descent, return. Where these actions are ritualized, systems endure longer and break more gently. Where they are ignored, systems shatter. In the absence of gods, societies attempt to outsource these functions to institutions. Laws replace ritual. Therapy replaces lament. Regulation replaces humility. These substitutions work imperfectly. They lack symbolic force. They manage symptoms rather than structure. Inanna's myths addressed structure directly. This is why her story still resonates in moments of crisis. When economies crash, people speak of reckoning. When political orders fail, they speak of renewal. When personal identities collapse, people speak of transformation. The language persists because the experience persists. Inanna named it first. Her insistence that descent precede return remains deeply uncomfortable. Modern culture prefers ascension narratives: improvement, optimization, transcendence. Descent implies loss of control, dignity, and certainty. It cannot be branded or accelerated. It takes time. It resists efficiency. Yet without it, return becomes impossible. Inanna's descent stripped her of every symbol of power. Modern systems resist such stripping. Leaders cling to authority. Institutions defend legitimacy. Individuals protect identity. The result is prolonged instability. Collapse substitutes for ritual stripping, inflicting far greater damage. The final irony of Inanna's endurance is that she survives best where she is least acknowledged. She governs feedback loops that no ideology can override. Ecological collapse follows the same pattern she described: excess extraction, denial of limit, violent correction. Psychological breakdown follows the same path: suppressed emotion, accumulation, rupture, forced integration. These are not metaphors. They are manifestations of the same logic operating across scales. Inanna did not invent this logic. She articulated it. Her myths functioned as early systems theory encoded in narrative. As the world grows more interconnected, the margin for error shrinks. Cycles accelerate. Consequences amplify. Recognition becomes more urgent. Inanna's relevance increases precisely because denial becomes more costly. She does not promise salvation. She promises continuity through honesty. She does not offer redemption. She offers recalibration. These offerings do not flatter human desire for mastery. They undermine it. Inanna's disappearance from worship marks the moment humanity attempted to govern itself without acknowledging intensity as sacred force. The experiment continues. Its results are mixed. Progress occurs. Collapse follows. Renewal struggles to keep pace. Her story does not judge this experiment. It explains it. It suggests that denial is not neutral. It accumulates pressure. Pressure seeks release. Release arrives as breakdown if ritual release is unavailable. Inanna required mourning because mourning diffused pressure. She required dissent because dissent redistributed power. She required return because continuity mattered. Remove these requirements, and the system improvises them through crisis. This is her final authority. She governs not belief, but behavior. She does not need temples because her domain is lived experience. She does not need priests because her logic enforces itself. At the end of this long exploration, what remains is not a goddess enthroned in heaven, but a pattern etched into how life organizes itself. Inanna was never merely a character. She was a map. The map does not age. It remains accurate as long as humans build systems fueled by desire and constrained by limits. It remains relevant as long as loss remains unavoidable and renewal remains necessary. Inanna's story ends not with resolution, but with continuation. That is not failure, it is fidelity to reality. She began as a star observed at dawn and dusk, appearing and disappearing, never fixed. She ends as a principle equally elusive and equally present. She cannot be held. She can only be recognized. And recognition, as she always demanded, is the price of return.